Sorry about that. We'll go ahead and introduce our illustrious speaker for the night about the wonderful, incomparable Josephine Baker. And so Kristen D. Burton earned her PhD in transatlantic history in 2015 from the University of Texas at Arlington. Dr. Burton is a historian of cultural and social history, specializing in cross-cultural exchanges and personal encounters across the Atlantic Basin. She has been teaching history courses at the university level, both in class and online since the spring of 2013, teaching at the University of Texas at Arlington, Louisiana University, and Loyola University, New Orleans. From 2018 to 2021, she joined the staff at the National World War II Museum to create original classroom curriculum on the history of World War II, designed for grades 7 through 12. Also, while at the museum, Dr. Burton hosted and authored original scripts for the podcast To the Best of My Ability, which focused on the Truman administration during the end and the aftermath of World War II. In the fall of 2021, Dr. Burton joined the faculty in the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta to teach courses on U.S. history, the history of gender and sexuality, and the history of food and drink. Dr. Burton's monograph, Slow Yet Sure Poison, How Alcohol Became an Intoxicant and the Origins of the Temperance Movement, is forthcoming from Louisiana University Press, with an expected publication in 2022. So thank you, Dr. Burton, for being here. I know we want to jump in because Josephine had such an amazing life and a long life and did so many things. So I will pass this on over to you.
Thank you, Tara. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. I'm thrilled to be here and I'm thrilled to reconnect with New Orleans, even if virtually. As you can see, I've got some beads hanging up trying to keep that Mardi Gras spirit alive. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and pull up my presentation, and we are going to talk about the absolutely remarkable, incomparable Josephine Baker. Go ahead and share this presentation. So Josephine Baker, thankfully has been getting a bit of a resurgence in acknowledgement and attention, but for so long has been generally known as an entertainer of the 1920s, 1930s, associated with exotic dancing, vaudeville, and things of this nature. But she was a multi-talented entertainer. She engaged in vaudeville, yes, but she was also a performer whose range extended to the opera. She performed in a number of films, but there's also so much more to her life. And she is truly one of the most remarkable individuals that I've had the pleasure to learn more about. And I'm going to do my best to share as much as I can about how remarkable she is, although it is only going to be the absolute tip of the iceberg. So a little background on Miss Josephine Baker. So here we have in a picture, little baby Josephine, 2 years old at the time this was taken. She was born Frida Josephine McDonald in St. Louis, Missouri on June 3rd, 1906. Her mother's name was Carrie, and she worked as a washerwoman. And her father is largely believed to have been a vaudeville drummer named Eddie Carson. This has been a point of dispute, but for the most part, people tend to believe that Eddie Carson and Carrie McDonald were Josephine's parents. Josephine and her mother had a strained relationship. When Josephine was very young, her father left the family, leaving Josephine's mother to care for herself as well as another young child younger than her. And Josephine believed much of the conflict with her mother resulted from this strained relationship. Sorry, the strained relationship resulted from the reminder that Josephine brought her mother of her father. So for a time, Josephine was in and out of her mother's house. She did live for a time with her grandmother, whose name was Elvira, and her grandmother was an indigenous woman and also a former slave. And while at her grandmother's house, Josephine learned a number of traditional tribal dances And her grandmother also helped teach Josephine how to make costumes. And Josephine would wear these costumes around the house and put on little performances. So even from a very early age, she was a natural entertainer. And she took this to the neighborhood as well. She would put on performances for neighborhood children, putting boards on tops of boxes to make little benches. And she would even charge the children a penny to attend, because she was always, first and foremost, ahead of the curve when it came to performing to make a little money. But at the age of 7, Josephine went back to living with her mother. And in that time, her mother decided it was time for Josephine to take up work, to take up a job to help support the family. So at the age of 8, she began working as a live-in maid for white families in St. Louis. One of the households that she lived and worked in was the household of a widowed woman. And this woman was abusive to Josephine. One time, Josephine made the mistake of adding too much soap to the laundry. And as a result, the woman she was working for burned her hands as a punishment. So this was not a thing that she intended to do for very long. And at the age of just 11 years old, she got out of that situation and was looking to find a better path forward. But it was at that same time, in that same year, that she happened to bear witness to the East St. Louis race riots of 1917. This was an incredibly formative event for young Josephine, and she would recall it throughout her life. Later on, much later on in her later years, she would recall this event stating, quote, "I can still see myself standing on the west bank of the Mississippi, looking over into East St. Louis and watching the glow of the burning of Negro homes lighting the sky. We children stood huddled together in bewilderment, frightened to death with the screams of the Negro families running across this bridge with nothing but what they had on their backs as their worldly belongings. So with this vision, I ran and ran and ran," end quote. At the age of 13, Josephine, young Josephine there, at the age of 13, she became a waitress at the Old Chauffeurs Club. This was a popular spot with jazz musicians. At the time, Josephine was actually living on the streets of St. Louis. She wasn't even living in her mother's home anymore. She tried to manufacture cardboard shelters, and while also working at the club, would dance on street corners as a way to earn a little extra money. But while she was working at the Old Chauffeurs Club, she met her first husband, Willie Wells. And this was a marriage that was brief. It lasted about a year, maybe a little less. She was 13 at the time. But that connection with Willie Wells and working at the club gave Josephine her earliest connection to other performers. And it was through that connection that she began dancing with vaudeville troupes. At the age of 15, Josephine met William Howard Baker at a party. And within a few months, the young couple eloped. So this is her second husband. And again, still at the young age of 15. And while this marriage would also come to a quick end, because Josephine's vaudeville troupe that she was performing with began booking shows in New York City, this union is important because it gave her the surname Baker. And this would be the name that she kept and continued to use as a part of her identity and celebrity for the rest of her life. When Josephine left St. Louis for New York to perform with her vaudeville troupe, she vowed, quote, "I'm leaving here a nobody, but someday I'm gonna be somebody, and you ain't gonna get to see me because I ain't ever coming back here again." And with that, Josephine left St. Louis and went to New York City to find better options, to pursue a better life. And she was successful. She managed to land a spot in the touring company of a popular Broadway revue called Shuffle Along. And this helped give her career some momentum. She toured with this company for a few years. And in the process of touring, as a part of the chorus line, she still began to build a reputation as a dancer and a comedic performer. And it was while she was touring, she caught the attention of a white American socialite named Caroline Dudley Reagan, who was planning an all-Black revue called La Revue Negra to perform at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in Paris. The offer was $250 a week. Josephine understandably accepted this remarkable opportunity, a spot in Reagan's cast, and on departing, she remembered that moment when she left with this absolutely remarkable quote. "I can only recall one single day of fear in my life. It was September 15th, 1925. And that was the day a 19-year-old Josephine sailed for France." And I have to just say as a remark that to say that this is her one day of fear in her life says so much about Josephine Baker, a young woman who lived and witnessed race riots as a child, who would later go on to live through World War II and Nazi occupation. But this was the one time that she felt that fear. And I think that says a lot about who she was. So unlike in the United States, France did not segregate by race. And when Josephine and her castmates boarded a train in France, they were surprised and delighted to learn that they could sit anywhere that they liked. Josephine was also shocked to see the costumes that were created for her to perform in this particular show. One consisted only of a bikini bottom covered in flamingo feathers. This was unlike anything she had ever done before in her life. But after one performance, Josephine quickly took to this kind of exotic dancing, and it became a quintessential part of her early career. And she became a rising star in the cast. And as her popularity rose, they began to feature her on the show's posters that they would post around France. Of course, the most famous costume to come out of this run in La Revue Negra was the famous banana skirt pictured here on the right. This is probably the most iconic image associated with Josephine Baker. But her career took on so much more breadth and depth as she continued to rise in popularity, and her celebrity continued to grow while she was working as an entertainer in France. She transformed from an exotic dancer into La Grande Diva Magnifique. She began starring in a number of films in the late 20s and early 30s, including Siren of the Tropics and Zuzu. And she also starred in an opera titled La Creole. Ernest Hemingway quipped that Baker was, quote, "the most sensational woman anybody ever saw." And throughout these years, it is believed she became the wealthiest Black woman alive. And as you can see in this picture of her with her pet cheetah named Chiquita, that she leaned in and embraced this new life and the opportunities it opened to her. She enjoyed the riches that came with this celebrity that was hard earned. And one of my favorite stories about Josephine is that she would walk this cheetah down the streets of Paris on a leash, and it would wear a collar covered in diamonds. And one time she had the Chiquita with her while rehearsing for a performance, and Chiquita jumped into the orchestra pit and absolutely terrified the people who were down there. But she was like, don't worry about it. It was fine. So it's just absolutely remarkable. But in 1928, Josephine departed on a European tour. Her first stop scheduled for Vienna. Josephine was not aware of the political unrest that was building in the region at that time. Just a few years earlier, in 1925, Adolf Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf, had been published, and it began popularizing racist ideology throughout the area. Before Josephine even arrived in Vienna, Posters began appearing around the city, protesting her performance, calling her, quote, a black devil. St. Paul's Church in Vienna rang its bells as a warning to the city when her train arrived. And as she rode in a carriage to her hotel, protesters lined the streets. Josephine said the scene reminded her of the race riots that she witnessed and that shook her community as a child. But in spite of the protests, Josephine still performed, and many in Vienna attended to see her. She encountered more welcome receptions as she continued to tour across Europe. She carried that tour to South America and then later to the United States. But hoping for a triumphant return, Josephine instead encountered continued racial prejudice and segregation. In a 1936 turn on Broadway, performing in the famous Ziegfeld Follies, Josephine found herself angry and disappointed. She faced a lot of public criticism. Time magazine referred to her as, quote, a Negro wench. The hotel that her manager had booked for her to stay in refused to give her a room. Josephine would later recall this experience, stating, quote, I have walked into the palaces of kings and queens and into the houses of presidents, but I could not walk into a hotel in America and get a cup of coffee. Now, this experience was absolutely devastating to Josephine, and she would begin the process of renouncing her American citizenship and becoming a French citizen upon her return to Paris. But at the start of World War II, in 1939, Josephine's future performances were put on hold. At the time, Josephine was married to her third husband, a French sugar broker and a Jewish man named Jean Lyon. The couple would later divorce in 1941, but in that time, Josephine came to represent so much of what Hitler and the Nazis hated. She was a successful Black woman in an interracial marriage with a Jewish man, and she was also a queer woman and what we would today describe as bisexual. And she had multiple long-term and somewhat public relationships with other women. Famously, in 1939, she engaged in an affair with Frida Kahlo. But when the Germans began to advance on Paris in 1940, Josephine joined the millions of other Parisians and fled the city. Josephine moved to a chateau that she rented in the south of France, where she took in other refugees fleeing the Nazis. After the fall of Paris, Josephine came into contact with Jacques Abti, who was the head of the French counter-military intelligence. Abti was looking to recruit people who would be able to engage in espionage to help resistance efforts against the Nazi occupation. Josephine was an ideal candidate for this work, as her celebrity allowed her to move more easily between countries across Europe and even outside of Europe. And this celebrity also offered her enhanced protection as she moved across this continent embroiled in war. So when Abti approached Josephine to see if she would take the risk and join the resistance, she said, quote, France made me what I am. I will be grateful forever. The people of Paris have given me everything. I am ready, Captain, to give them my life. You can use me as you wish. So Josephine began helping refugees who were fleeing the Nazis and helping them find a place to stay, oftentimes hosting them in her own chateau. And in the midst of all this, she began seeking out and identifying potential spies for interrogation, people who could join the resistance effort. While housing resistance fighters at her home, she would supply them with visas and work to help them move about safely as possible. She would also attend parties and diplomatic functions, which included parties at the Italian embassy or encountering ambassadors from Japan and military leaders of the Axis powers. And she would talk to these individuals, these high-ranking Axis bureaucrats or military leaders, and charm them. And she would use that to collect information on German troop movements. She would find out what harbors or airfields that were in action. And she was so sure of her celebrity and her connections, and that they would protect her, that no one would suspect her of espionage. She wrote down the intelligence that she gathered on her hands, her arms. She would pin notes on the inside of her underwear, because she knew she would never have to face a strip search. And she was right. When General Charles de Gaulle recruited help for the French resistance effort from his base in London, Abti and Baker answered his call. The Nazis had gotten wind of resistance activity happening at Josephine's chateau, however, and they did pay a visit to her estate to question her. When they came by, Josephine was hiding several resistance fighters in the chateau at that time. So this is understandably a terrifying and tense experience for Josephine. But when a Nazi officer said to her that they were informed she was hiding weapons at her chateau, she responded, quote, "I think Monsieur l'officier cannot be serious. The only dance I've never taken part in is the war dance." She was able to successfully charm the Nazis when they questioned her, so they did leave her be at that time. But that close encounter was enough for Josephine to know that it was time to leave France. So Abti contacted de Gaulle, who instructed both Abti and Baker to travel to London via Lisbon in Portugal, which was neutral. The pair carried between them over 50 different classified documents and pieces of secret intelligence. Josephine carried hers by writing the information down using invisible ink on her sheet music. They were able to successfully connect with de Gaulle. And then Josephine and Jacques Abti traveled to North Africa, moving from Algiers to Casablanca. And while there, Josephine continued to give performances, move about freely, and still all the while collecting and passing on secret information to the resistance fighters that were located in the area at that time. While in Morocco, though, Josephine suffered a miscarriage that nearly killed her. And so she was hospitalized from June 1941 to December 1942. Some of the papers began to report that she had actually died, but when the news of her death reached her, she contacted a reporter and stated, "There has been a slight error. I am much too busy to die." But as she was still recovering, she bore witness to the landing of US troops near Casablanca. And in spite of her feelings toward her home country and the humiliation that she had suffered from racial prejudice while she was there, she wrote down upon seeing the American soldiers, quote, "That's the Americans for you. Europe doesn't know their force or their will. They'll win this war for us," end quote. As the Allied troops stationed in Casablanca sought some form of entertainment, the director of the Liberty Club, which was an entertainment center opened by the Red Cross to give space and performances for the troops, they contacted Josephine about performing for the soldiers. But like the US military at the time, the Liberty Club was segregated. Josephine accepted the invitation, but on the condition that she would only perform to a desegregated audience. And she argued, quote, "We've got to show that Blacks and whites are treated equally in the American army, or else what's the point of waging war on Hitler?" The Liberty Club agreed to desegregate. Over the next 2 years, Josephine continued to perform for the Allied forces for free. She also began auctioning off several pieces of jewelry to raise funds for the resistance movement. Following D-Day and then the eventual liberation of Paris, Josephine finally returned to her adopted city, and she did so wearing a military uniform. She quickly took note of the terrible conditions many French people were living in, especially the elderly, and just the horrible aftermath left by the Nazis' occupation. So she continued to sell off her fine goods, jewelry, furs, anything else that she had to raise money so she could buy food and coal for the poor people of Paris. And you can see her here personally handing that food out to people who were in need. Following Germany's surrender in 1945, General Charles de Gaulle awarded Josephine the Croix de Guerre and the Rosette de la Resistance. He also named her a Chevalier de Légion d'honneur, which is the highest order of merit for both military and civil action. And news of Josephine's efforts during the war began to spread, and it gave her a new level of gravitas and acclaim. Heading into the 1950s, she remained one of Paris's leading entertainers. And in 1951, she received an invitation to perform once more in the United States. This return to her country of origin provided a stark contrast to her 1930s visit. This time, Josephine insisted on performing for desegregated audiences. She won that battle and headlined a sold-out run in Miami. Following that, she performed on a national tour. For this turn, she received rave reviews. And during a visit to Harlem, a parade was held in her honor that drew a crowd of over 100,000 people. Her insistence on performing for desegregated audiences, however, made her a target for white supremacists, and she received threats from people who were a part of the Ku Klux Klan. Josephine responded to these threats by stating that these warnings and these threats to her health and safety did not frighten her. Josephine's touring success did not spare her from experiencing continued racism while in the United States. Hotels and restaurants refused her service, and when this did happen, she would publicly name those places and call them out as she went along, fearless of the repercussions. She also began working with the NAACP, but interestingly enough, she also faced resistance from advocates for civil rights. People who were a part of the civil rights movement began to worry that her earlier work in exotic dancing might prove detrimental to the movement. Others believed that her move to France appeared as a form of abandonment of the United States and the individuals who were still stuck there, and that this might undercut her work on civil rights in the US. So even though she was based in France, she continued to follow and support the civil rights movement. She would return to the US in 1963 to become one of the few women to speak at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. She spoke about her previous life experiences in this speech, referencing the race riot that she lived through, the discrimination that she faced during later tours, but she also acknowledged that the fight would continue well beyond her life. And in this speech, she stated, quote, "I am not a young woman now, friends. My life is behind me. There is not too much fire burning inside me. And before it goes out, I want you to use what is left to light that fire in you so that you can carry on and so that you can do those things that I have done. Professional and personal upheaval shaped Josephine's life in significant ways, but none more so than her desire to have children. Due to her health, she was never able to have children of her own. As Josephine responded to all other challenges in her life that she encountered throughout her past, she still found a way to achieve what she sought in building a family. And throughout her life, she adopted a total of 13 children, who she collectively called her Rainbow Tribe. Her children traveled with her as she continued to perform into the 1970s. And in 1975, Josephine performed one last time to a sold-out crowd. 4 days later, on April 12th, she passed away, found lying in her bed, surrounded by rave reviews of that last performance. Josephine Baker was far more than a vaudeville dancer and a jazz singer. She was a force of nature who achieved the highest levels of celebrity, and her status became a shield against which she could fight structural racism and the horrors of the Nazi regime. Her legacy received renewed admiration when, in this past November of 2021, Josephine Baker became the first Black woman and first American to be inducted into the French Pantheon, the French nation's mausoleum of heroes. Fearless and outspoken, Josephine Baker found new ways to challenge those who sought to diminish or silence the suffering or oppressed. In strengthening her own voice, she found innumerable ways to both charm and resist. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burton. That was fantastic. I actually was getting teary-eyed when I was listening to that last part. So does anyone have any questions for Dr. Burton? This is such amazing subject matter, and it's hard to condense a life into, especially that life, into, 40 minutes. So kudos to you. I'm sure there are things that you really wanted to say that you weren't able to say. Does anyone... Oh, Claire. Claire first and then Rachel. Oh, you're muted. Oh, yeah.
Oh, hi there. Well, actually, this is Chris, Claire's husband.
Hi, Chris.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you for such a really wonderful presentation. I'm curious to learn more about the French acceptance of African American artists. I'm reminded, years later, Miles Davis was, broadly accepted and embraced by Paris as an African American artist. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that. Was it unique to the French? Was it across Europe? I just was listening to you speak, which was a great reminder that, while African American artists were being shut out here in the United States, they were being accepted in Europe. And I'm curious if you just can talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was more common across Europe, depending on where one went. That there wasn't segregation based on racial identities like it existed in the United States. So that's an important qualifier, because segregation was such an embedded part of life in the US, especially in the South and in places like St. Louis, where Josephine grew up, that it was just a stark change for all of the performers in Josephine's cast. They all remarked on how kind of nice that it was, just such a remarkable difference from what they had experienced back in the US. Otis Redding had a similar experience when he toured in England in the 1960s. So this is something that was more of an effect of Europe being a place that, while it did colonize, did not have the same roots and foundation as a slave society like the United States did. But that being said, France was a colonial power and did colonize parts of Africa and has its own deeply entrenched, difficult history of colonization and racism. And some people have speculated that one of the reasons why in November 2021, Josephine Baker was inducted into the Pantheon was a way for France to try to kind of make amends or like put a positive spin on this recent confrontation that's been happening with this colonial history. So it's complicated to say the least. Racism did and continues to exist in France, but segregation and the nature of racism just was very different. It didn't exist the same way in France as it did in the United States. And by and large, Paris and the French people were very accepting, and they came to love Josephine Baker, as did pretty much everyone who came into contact with her. She was just such a charming and had that kind of personality that would pull people in regardless. So that was, it's a complicated, it's not probably not a very good straightforward answer because it's still a pretty complicated history to address. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Rachel, I see that you have your hand raised.
Yes, hi. I was wondering if you know whether or not Josephine's children carried on her legacy of activism.
Yeah, yes. So I don't know as much about the entirety of the Rainbow Tribe, what they've gone on to do with their lives. I know one of her sons, Claude, became essentially a historian and biographer of her life and made it a key part of his life to tell her story and to try to find out as much as he could about who she was and the things that she did. So in that way, they've tried to kind of carry the mantle a bit. But I'm unfortunately less familiar with the activities of her children since her passing. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Does anybody else have any questions or any thoughts about all of the information that Dr. Burton has presented to us tonight? I know it's a lot to think about and to process, that one person could do all of these things.
Yeah.
Dr. Davis, yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm sorry. I should have found my raise hand emoji, but again, it's a long day. Thank you for your presentation. My question is about recordings. Are there any recordings that are available of Josephine Baker singing that you would recommend that you've come across in your research?
Well, so there's a lot of good videos on YouTube that you can find. In terms of any that I'd recommend, I would recommend any because she's such an incredible performer. It's hard to get a hold of her movies. Her films are harder to come by, but there's a great you can find clips of her performing and as a vaudeville performer. You can find clips of her performing in that iconic banana skirt outfit. You can also find her later 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s performances as well. Honestly, just as many as you can find because she has such a beautiful voice. She's so charismatic and she just owns that stage the second she steps foot on it. Just probably one of the most remarkable and most versatile performers I've that run across at any point in reading about this stuff. So all the above, really. Yeah.
Hey, I couldn't figure out how to find the hand either, so forgive me for that. But I'd like to ask, you referenced, of course, how she continued to perform well into her later years. But I'd like to know what, post-war, and her becoming a mother and reaching middle age, what kind of performing was she doing? Had it really shifted basically all the way to being a singer, or what kind of elements of her earlier fame in terms of a performer was she still involved in?
Mostly singing. So she would dance a little, but as she did get older in age, Most of her performances tended to revolve around singing, and she would have dancers around her that she would dance with, but not nearly anything on the level as she did earlier in her career, where she was doing like somersaults and flips over people's backs, just doing really remarkable acrobatics. But you can also see in those pictures that I had of her later performances, she would wear these really grand head dresses, which would limit one's movement to say the least. But I mean, just one of the flamboyance of the costume. She had diamond covered microphones. It's just absolutely extravagant. But yeah, she was mostly singing by the end for the most part.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm. I think I saw a question pop up in the chat. Did her sexuality impact her career? No, not really. So she was unapologetic from childhood to the end of her life. And just Josephine Baker was going to do what Josephine Baker wanted to do. And she took on a number of lovers throughout her life. Jacques Abti and her also became romantically involved. They tried to have children together. Their attempt to have children is what prompted the hysterectomy, or the miscarriage that led to a hysterectomy, and then ultimately ended all efforts she or hopes she could have had to have her own children. But in terms of relationships with women like Frida Kahlo and other individuals that she encountered that we may or may not know about, unapologetic, fearless, and had no effect on her career. The only instances in which you could say that the sexuality and her reputation for that may have affected her would be this pushback that she received from some individuals involved with the civil rights movement, because they were very image focused, and for good reasons, that they were trying to achieve specific ends, and they were very aware that any little thing might be used against them. So that was why there was concerns by civil rights advocates about her earlier life as an exotic dancer. But that didn't stop her from working with the NAACP, supporting civil rights efforts. She received a Medal of Honor from the NAACP for her work, and essentially she did and lived as she sought to do, and made the most of it. Even when she was experiencing, I didn't talk about this, the financial hardship and bankruptcy, she still found ways to survive, regardless of any circumstance that came her way. See another question in the chat. Why don't you think she's known more as an icon in the queer community? I think honestly, the attention Josephine Baker is receiving is not only long overdue, but it's refreshing, but it's still fairly recent. I would say like 10 years ago, if you said the name Josephine Baker, people might think about a dancer in a banana skirt, but that might be the extent of it. I think in the film that about Frida Kahlo's life, in which Salma Hayek portrayed Frida Kahlo, they do depict that relationship that she had with Josephine Baker. But the movie wasn't about Josephine Baker. And there was another movie that came out in the 90s, I think, maybe late 80s, about Josephine's life, but it really didn't get the attention. It wasn't like a big mainstream hit. So it's really interesting and fascinating that she's kind of been around in cultural zeitgeists and, presences and cultural depictions, but always is seemingly on the periphery, but only in like recent years. She's just kind of blown up, and I love to see it. And I really think this induction of her into the French Pantheon drew a lot of attention to her life, the things she did, and people are learning a lot more about Josephine Baker today. Any good movies you would recommend about her life, or not quite yet? The one they did in the 90s, was it early 90s? I think.
Yes.
I can't recall the
It was
name.
the early 90s with Lynn Whitfield.
That's right. Yes. I cannot think of another movie that's about her life. I think that's pretty much it. Yeah.
I think you are right. I said, I think you are right, which is a shame, because
Yeah.
she has enough there's enough about her life to make 15, 20 movies without even breaking a sweat. So,
Absolutely. Yeah.
you know,
I say, get Tessa Thompson into a movie studio, get to work. You can do some incredible things, but yeah, there's really not that much out there just yet.
yeah, I think you hit on something, and I think it is it Heather? No, Beth, I'm sorry, my screen is moving. Oh, Hannah, about her sexuality. It's just so, it's recently, these are topics that we are talking about, unfortunately,
Yeah.
until,
Yeah.
so maybe that's what it is, and hopefully we'll see some movies. I don't know. What do you think?
I would love, I mean, yes, I would love to see it. And honestly, it's one of those things where she never really identified anything about her sexuality because she just was, she's just, I'm Josephine Baker, and that's pretty much it. And so she never really referred to herself as bisexual. This is a label that we are applying to her after the fact. But she loved who she loved and lived as carefree of a life as I shouldn't say carefree, fearless of a life as one possibly could, just truly just unstoppable and fearless. Yeah.
Oh, I see another one. What are
Hey, you
your
may need this one, yeah?
well, maybe. What are your thoughts on the portrayal of Josephine in the opera and homage to Josephine Baker? You didn't get to see the opera, did you?
No, unfortunately not.
I know we talked about that. We're gonna find a way. We're gonna find a way.
Virtual streaming.
I don't know. Beth, did you want to hear maybe what some of us thought, or because unfortunately, Dr. Burton has not had a chance to see the opera. Hopefully more companies will do the opera.
Yeah.
It is fantastic. It is a powerful 30 minutes. It genuinely is. And what I can say about the opera that is so fantastic is that it is all her own words taken from interviews and articles and things. So, I got to spend some time with Laquita Mitchell, who played our Josephine, this was her second time in this role. And one of the things that she said was so hard for her was, every opera is dramatic. Every opera, has a certain heart-wrenching element to it. But to live those 30 minutes every night and to talk about the struggles, and Laquita also knew one of Josephine's sons, talk about those struggles and to live there in that space. She said, and I know she wouldn't mind me saying this, when she first got to rehearsal, she's like, I'm not a crier. I would just start crying. She's like, I would just have to stop singing and go to the back of the room and start crying because, inhabiting that character. And imagine Josephine walked around that way all the time. And we don't know if she cried or didn't, but we didn't see it.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. And I will just add too, it's not the opera that you all were able to have in New Orleans, but at the Fringe Festival that happened here in Edmonton this past summer, I believe. I can't remember the exact dates of it. It happened shortly after I arrived, but they did have a show. It was a one-woman show called Josephine, and it was on the life of Josephine Baker. And I just looked up the name of the performer. She was Tamisha Harris, who did a one-woman show, and I was able to catch a virtual stream of that, and it was beautifully done. And just one person on a stage telling the entire life story of Josephine Baker in the most remarkable way. So more productions are getting out there, and I think more people are learning about her through these mediums.
All right, I think we have time for this last question. Josephine was very audacious and bold. Do you know if she ever fought back against the woman who burned her hands when she was a live-in maid, or did she become more bold, outspoken over time as she got older?
So essentially, when she was suffering abuse as a child, working as a live-in maid, after like the hand burning incident, she said, I'm done with this, and just got out of there. Like even what she was 8 to 11 years old, somewhere in that time frame that this happened, just a kid. And she had the presence of mind to say, it's not safe, it's not for me. And she just left that whole situation, tried to go back to living with her family, but that fell apart as well. So by the age of 13, she was essentially houseless and living on the streets of St. Louis. But she wasn't going to put up with anything from anybody. And she acknowledges that in her speech in the March on Washington, where she was like, if you make me mad, I'm going to open up my mouth and shout about it. And that became the way that she lived. I think it's something that she became more outspoken and bold as she grew older, as all of us do. But I really think also that the experiences of living in France and being able to live freely in this a society that didn't treat her with the same kind of vitriol and racism that she faced in the United States, that gave her a new perspective on life, that we don't have to live like this and we don't have to put up with this. And she was very vocal about that.
Awesome. Wonderful. Okay. One last question. Do we know if the hand burning affected her later life at all?
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I've ever read or heard.
Awesome. Yeah. Dr. Burton, thank you for your openness and sharing everything that you know. This has been fantastic. I'm trying to find other things to talk about now with you. This has been so wonderful. Thank you all for being here. We hope to see you again. And until next time, y'all, everybody stay warm.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.